Recently, I know I've been talking a lot about books on the page, but I've been immersed in what historians call this neo-slave history, neo-slave narrative genres. I like to use the term neo-enslaved narrative genres. And essentially what it is are books where fiction writers take the subject of slavery and they go back to the time period and write from the perspective of the enslaved person. And in developing this kind of fuel for it, this hunger for it. Like whenever I read these books, I find myself reading them in like a day. I'll get through an entire book in a day or two because it's just like, there's such a lack of knowledge about the personal experience of the enslaved throughout history that when I find a story that tells these people's stories in a way that is authentic to who they were and the lives they lived and just their humanity, it just makes me want to read more and more. So I'm writing an article about it for Substack. I'm also making a long form video for it, my first video essay on YouTube. Both will be available later this month. But I've been starting my research on JSTOR, and I want to read one of the quotes that I highlighted in this article called The Power of the Neo-Slave Narrative Genre by Joan Nadeau and Marie Helena Lima. And in their article, they say the main reasons for this seemingly widespread desire to rewrite a genre that officially lost its usefulness with the abolition of slavery are the will to reaffirm the historical value of the original slave narrative and to reclaim the humanity of the enslaved by reimagining their subjectivity. And that's it. Like, that's the point. And they have many more great quotes in it. And I think they talk a lot about like the fact that how Toni Morrison writes in Beloved and in Mercy, there's a need to access the interior lives of slaves via her imagination to bear witness to the interior life of people who didn't write their history, which doesn't mean they didn't have it, to fill the blanks that the slave narrative left. So there are like stories, right? And I'm gonna also share my collection of books that kind of speak to the experience of the enslaved, whether those are nonfiction and fiction. But there are stories, and I have read some of them, and I have others that I don't have physical copies of, that I have like PDFs on my phone or my computer, like Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston, which talks about like the actual lived experience of enslaved persons and people who lived through the transatlantic slave trade, people who lived through American slavery and ultimately freedom. And there are stories like in history projects like the 1619 Project, which does a little bit of reimagination and constructive reimagination through these stories and these projects, but also through the poems, but also uses history to tell the story about slavery in general. Also, my copy is signed by Nikole Hannah-Jones, humble brag. She signed my copy at Baldwin & Co. in New Orleans. And there are stories like 12 Years a Slave by Solomon North. Also, I have the Frederick Douglass, oh, it is right here. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. So I have read stories from the first person perspective of American slaves, but there is a focus in those stories on like, sometimes it feels like hyperbole, and also it feels like the narrative of the escaping. Whereas these stories like Homecoming focuses on one, like the loss that occurred for generations of people across the diaspora, or the emotional toll that occurred in each individual person's life at each level of slavery as the slave trade progressed on and continued on. Or Kindred, which kind of chronicles just like this space and this legacy between like slavery and white supremacy, and juxtaposing it with 1970 America and a Black woman who's drawn back in time like over and over again to it, or the true story about Nat Turner's Rebellion, or the story about Joshua Glover's rescue in Wisconsin, which chronicles, which this more so chronicles the perspective and the legal battle that the white people were dealing with, and less about the person and the humanity and the space in general, which I think kind of goes to show again the need for projects like Beloved and Amity and Homegoing, because these focus on the people who were impacted by slavery. These focus on the decisions they had to make, the impossible choices that they had to make, the ways that their humanity was stripped and subjected from them really without their control or input. And there's just such a need for that type of work in society, because that's the thing we miss when we don't have critical analysis about slavery and critical conversations about it. And I think that because our country is so focused on, like, we're in a space now where America does not want to talk about slavery because it doesn't want white people to feel bad for talking about it. But there's an absence of evaluation of the way that Black Americans have lost centuries of emotions of those who were actually enslaved because there's no written history of it. And so I think it's so important that we read neo-enslaved narrative genres because they really do kind of transport us to a time period and a space and tell stories that we otherwise wouldn't know. Again, I guess I'll put a description of these books in the comments, but there's a bunch of them. I'm currently searching for many more. I'm hoping to read more books outside of the American perspective of slavery because I do think that it's important to learn about the ways in which other folks liberated themselves out of slavery and the effects that colonialization has had internationally on Black people, on Africans and descendants of Africans. So, but yeah, I'm excited for this project to come out. I hope y'all watch it. Again, it's gonna be on YT and Substack, so please, please, please watch it if you're interested in learning more about what I think and also what I'm learning. I'll be sure to share all of these resources as I'm compiling them. All of the JSTOR articles, all the things will be linked in the descriptions and cited in the sources as I'm writing the documents. But that's all for this time. Love and light. See y'all later. Peace.